Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. This is the second debate of the Lyceum Debate series. Tonight's debate topic will be, is the Humean construction of natures and miracles correct? Defending said proposition will be Mathoma, and arguing against the proposition will be Logos. Now, Mathoma, your 10 minutes begins now.
Okay, thank you. So just to introduce the topic, the resolution, and some of the significance behind this resolution, we're all pretty familiar with the idea that some sort of miracle is often to be found as the basis of some religion. And nearly all religions have some sort of miracle at their foundation. And not only is it the basis of religions, but it's also often to be found around the surrounding narrative that makes religion to a coherent worldview. And also historically, too, there are many miracles that have been reported that give historical events meaning, such as Constantine's seeing of the apparition in this sign you shall conquer, and the relation this had to the development of Christianity in Rome. And the ancient world in general seems to be full of miracles. So, I mean, in our current scientific worldview, this is something that we should definitely examine in addition to everything else that we examine in this scientific worldview. Now, as I said, in the ancient world, miracles are to be found all over the place. Oftentimes, phenomena which were not completely understood were given a supernatural significance. These phenomena might include things like famines, plagues, medical illnesses. This also changes our worldview. Nowadays, we're accustomed to giving these apparently supernatural things like famines and plagues a naturalistic answer. We kind of have an idea of why famines and plagues occur at all. And in our new scientific worldview, we do not tend to trust these dogmas and superstitions of ancient theology either. I mean, we might still believe in God, but we see God as a divine intelligence who sets up the laws of nature and allows nature to take its natural course and not really intervening. I mean, we can still believe in a divine watchmaker, but some of the more extravagant claims of religion seem to be very unbelievable and rather extreme and superstitious. And given the success of the scientific worldview, I think we should take this empirical approach seriously. I mean, science depends upon empiricism, using the evidence of our senses to test hypotheses, develop models, and develop technology, and to get a better understanding of reality. And it's given us most of the progress in the modern world. It's developed the very devices we're using right now to have this debate about miracles. For reason, and this empirical scientific method should also critically examine all of the old historical claims that undergird these dogmas of religion, that if true, they would hold back our progress and hold humanity back from actualizing its potential. So what I'm proposing to do tonight is question whether miracles can be believed at all in the light of natural reason. Let me say what I'm not going to be arguing. I'm not going to be arguing that miracles are metaphysically impossible. I mean, we don't really have an excellent understanding of the essence of the natural world to absolutely rule out the possibility of miracles. I'm not going to argue that miracles can't be taken on faith or that there's no legitimacy to doing so. I mean, after all, we have many uncertainties in life. I mean, faith might have a role in this. I'm just examining in the light of natural reason. And what I'm going to do is give a couple of arguments, which are going to be arguing that in the light of natural reason, belief in miracles is warranted. So again, what I'm going to do is say miracles are unwarranted in the light of natural reason, not upon faith. And these are going to be on the basis of sense experience. Now, let me first say that I understand miracles to be violations of the laws of nature, and so is my opponent tonight. The religious people tend to attach more significance to the miracles, besides being violations of laws of nature, but we can just stick with violations of laws of nature right now. And by laws of nature, I understand these to be regularities in our sensory experience from the constant conjunction of one experience with another. For example, lead sinks when I place it into water. That's a regularity in my sensory experience. I mean, if lead were to somehow float, this experience would cry out for further explanation and further analysis. Now, these additional explanations are the things of real interest for us when someone claims that something miraculous has happened, when some law of nature has been violated, some regularity in our experience has been violated. Now, as a matter of rational principle, I'm going to say that when we have two mutually exclusive hypotheses, what we ought to do is weigh our belief according to the evidence and actually believe what is more likely or more probable. For example, if we have two hypotheses, X and Y, and X is more probable than Y, then we should actually believe X, at least for the time being in our current knowledge. Of course, nothing is going to be absolutely proven by this method, by this rational principle. But I take this sort of method to be absolutely essential to our scientific and empirical worldview. Next, whenever someone makes a claim that a miracle has happened, for example, a dead man has come back to life, we must also consider the possibility that the testimony that he's giving us is mistaken. Now, if we adopt the scientific principle of going with the more likely hypothesis, we must therefore weigh these two hypotheses. Firstly, the testimony is accurate, in which case the man actually came back to life, or the alternative hypothesis, which is that the man was mistaken in some way, that the testimony is false. Perhaps the man is mistaken, or perhaps he's lying to us. I mean, we don't have to know exactly how he's mistaken, but we must consider the possibility that he is mistaken. Now let's apply that principle of the most probable, going with the most probable hypothesis, to these two alternatives. Now, how often in our sense experience do we actually see men coming back from the dead? Now, for most of us, if not all of us, we've never actually seen such a thing take place using our sensory apparatus. On the contrary, our sense experience testifies to the negation. Dead men stay dead. So we actually have some evidence here. A dead man stayed dead. Let's remember that we have a tremendous amount of evidence of this sort in the regularities of our sense experience, which testify to the regularity of nature. Now, how much experience do we also have with people being mistaken or possibly lying? Well, certainly we have plenty of experience with that. I've certainly lied plenty of times myself. I've been wrong about things numerous times myself. And we know that other people have been wrong about things many, many times. And certainly we know this by sense experience as well. Therefore, applying our principle concerning likelihood, we shouldn't believe in the testimony of someone coming back from the dead and should accept that in some way the man is mistaken. Much more likely that he was mistaken than that his testimony is actually correct. Again, I need not know how he's mistaken, but only that it's more likely than an actual resurrection. Again, notice I'm not saying that absolutely such a resurrection did not happen or any other miracle, only that we don't have the evidence there to believe it rationally on the basis of natural reason. I'm going to go one step further here and claim that all miracles, not just this particular example of a resurrection, fall into the same sort of problem. Now, miracles by their very nature are special one-off occurrences in the way that they violate the laws of nature. The more remarkable, the more this miracle is going to be vulnerable to this sort of skeptical questioning about testimony. And the only way we can know about these supposed miracles is through historical testimony of someone else, because we weren't there ourselves. The trouble is this testimony can be questioned that I just described, where we consider the possibility that such a person's testimony is false. That is, he's mistaken in some way. He's mistaken, or possibly he's lying. And again, we have plenty of experience with people actually being wrong and lying about these sorts about things. Therefore, by this principle of going with the most likely hypothesis, we have to conclude, whether we like it or not, that we should not believe any reports of miracles on the basis of natural reason. Again, one could accept these sorts of things as matters of faith. That's fine. But as scientific men and women here, we should not believe in any of these miracles on natural reason alone. And unfortunately, the conclusion does fly in the face of most modern religions, the fundamentals of most modern religions, but in a sense, we have to deal with this. Furthermore, we don't have an experience of miracles actually taking place where we have sophisticated men and women, we have educated and literate people, all testifying to the same thing. These miracles always occur in rather barbaric places. And we're supposed to just accept their own testimony. Of course, this is a sort of ad hominem, but it is relevant when we consider testimony. We have to consider the character of the person making the testimony. If they're illiterate, perhaps it's cast doubt upon this, and I say that it does. Now, the empirical method and its use of skepticism has affected significant progress to move us away from this barbarism and superstitions of the ancient medieval worlds into our modern age. And what we have to do is let go of some of our fideistic and theological views. And we must test these miracles in light of the empirical method, just like we test everything else nowadays. Hypotheses and miracles on the one hand, and we were mistaken on the other. Human frailty seems to win the day by rational consideration. That is, the very ideas, the very miracles can be assented to. The idea that these miracles can be assented to by natural reason has been weighed in the balances and has been found wanting.
Your
And
time is up.
to end my opening there. Yeah.
So thank you for your opening statement, Mathoma. Logos, your 10 minutes begin now.
All right, everybody. Thank you for having me at this debate. I look forward to the conversation. I'm here to argue against the Humean framework of miracles, mainly that not only should they be thought of as possible, but people can be justified in believing them, or we can be justified in allowing people to believe them. So I'll start by noting that my opponent has conceded the idea that miracles are impossible. I've already prepared this introduction, so I guess I'll start off by discussing it anyway. It's a good thing we allow that the miracles might be possible, because undergirding this framework is the idea that everything is naturally caused if miracles are impossible, right? If everything is caused by nature and miracles violate the laws of nature, then by definition we exclude them. And what that would mean is we have to bring up all sorts of interesting questions of, okay, what is everything caused by nature? And so you get into the idea of, okay, are morals natural things? Are thoughts natural things? What does I exist mean in a purely causal framework? Very, very difficult questions. So it's good that we'll move beyond that. The next thing that he did talk about, my opponent in his opening, was the improbability of miracles due to their infrequency. Now, this is true in a frequentist model of statistics where you look at independent events over distribution, but the universe isn't independent. In fact, we need causality, right? Event A can cause event B for science to happen. It's how we set up experimental controls, among other things. So here's a general thought experiment. Suppose I'm rolling a 10,000-sided dice, and a miracle, quote unquote, occurs when I roll a 10,000 on that dice. Now suppose that I'm rolling, every time I fail to roll that 10,000, I roll a 1,000,000-sided dice. Now, if I roll a 1,000,000 on this new dice, then my previous roll will be changed to a 10,000. And if I fail to roll 1,000,000, then what's going to happen is the next time I roll the dice, the amount I need to roll on a 1,000,000-sided dice decreases by 1 in order to get the event. So I fail, I now don't need to roll 1,000,000, but 1 less, and so on. Well, we can say that getting the 10,000, normally speaking, would be like 0.01% of all possible outcomes. It's still going to be very, very, very rare relative to everything you could roll, even adding the extra condition in here. It'll be a low frequency. However, we can say with certainty that within 1,000,000 rolls, you have to roll that 10,000 at some point or another. And so it begs the question. As far as the universe is concerned, we have lived a while, and we've had writing for a while, and we've seen a whole lot, but have we seen enough to see everything? I mean, we know that the universe is cyclic. We have orbits. We have planets orbiting stars, which are centers of galaxies, which orbit other galaxies. Everything is cyclic, and sometimes things take a while to happen. It takes a while to see the full, spread of all possible causal events. So I think it's fair to say that miracles are very well possible, even in this statistical framework, because if you don't have independence, you can't necessarily claim the improbability of such things. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of testimony. And this is where I'm a little weak, but that's okay, because by this point in the discussion, if I've argued successfully and if I'm understood, me and my opponent are understood, we both agree that miracles are possible, so we don't have to defend that argument. We both agree that miracles aren't necessarily improbable, but they might happen to be improbable, so I no longer have to defend that. Right now, we're both going to be talking about a conversation about whether it's justified or not to believe in miracles. Now, just like my opponent gave ground in the beginning, I'm going to give ground now. I think there is a time and place to be skeptical of miracle claims. There's a time and place not to be skeptical of miracle claims. So when we apply standards of evidence in the way that Hume describes and in the way my opponent alluded to, there's usually a time and place to apply these standards. So for example, if you're in a trial, the freedom of one person is at stake if they're innocent, and the compensation by society for the victimization of another person is at stake if the perpetrator goes free, right? You're weighing a decision that has gravitas at both ends. Getting it right or wrong matters. And so you have to accordingly really balance that kind of stuff out and put full scrutiny on all the testimonies and everything else, to it. Now, how does this apply to miracle claims? Well, if somebody just comes up to me and says, hey, man, I heard my aunt, my great aunt, I was really close to her, and, she died tragically when I was young. And I heard her ghost talking to me, the other night, and I was very comforting, and it was great. Well, this is certainly miraculous. I mean, most people probably don't claim to hear ghosts. Dead men stay dead, that all that sort of stuff. So the question is, what's the justification here? Well, in my view, it's fine to let the person, think that this stuff is being said to them and go about it, because applying all the proper scrutiny to the claims requires one of two things. Either you say it's not likely, so it's never likely, and you just, wave it away out of hand, or you say you actually go through, perform a bunch of tests on their house and test a bunch of tests for ectoplasm or whatever the ghost hunters test for and all this stuff. It takes time and knowledge to test every single miracle claim every single person could ever possibly make. And I argue by virtue of opportunity cost that in most cases, it's probably just not very beneficial to go through the trouble. Okay, so what's wrong with the former case, right? Why don't we just dismiss all of this, preposterous testimony out of hand? Well, this actually comes back to what my opponent was saying earlier in his argument. Not all things that are claimed to be miracles are actually miracles. Sometimes naturally great things just happen to occur, and this could be in the case of technology and whatever else. So if we say, for example, dead men always stay dead, and somebody brings up a case where, this guy died, and this person came up to him, and that he had no pulse. I had no idea what was going on. I couldn't feel a heartbeat. I mean, he was dead. And say an ancient person saw this person come up to him with some kind of technology, touch it to his chest, and the person jolted back to life, right? That would be miraculous from their perspective. But nowadays, you might recognize such a technology as a defibrillator or some other similar thing. And this is constantly true. We're constantly getting better technology. We're constantly finding better things about the world. I wonder what the first people who saw the first airplane saw, for example. So believing that somebody might have seen something miraculous isn't necessarily believing a miracle has occurred. It could be the case, and you should, stay open to the possibility. But allowing that possibility also allows for other explanations as well, which are worth taking into account. So that's the other reason I say it's dangerous to discard their testimony out of hand completely. Now, here's the ground I'm definitely going to give on this. Right now, the examples I gave of miracles have been risk-free. Believing the person and comforting them in their belief costs me nothing, and it costs them nothing to believe it. There's no type 1 or type 2 error that actually gives us a problem in this instance. But there are cases where this could be. So suppose somebody says, hey, I heard God talk to me the other night. It's great. Now, suppose somebody said, hey, I heard God talk to me and he said, I should kill my son because God wants to start a new Abrahamic covenant. Okay, now this has more gravitas, because believing the person could put the child in danger, for example. And so now, with regard to the miracle claim, we actually have to regard some risk. What's the risk to the safety of the person, the child, other people involved? And so it makes the discussion much more complicated. And then, definitely then, I would be much more likely to adhere to the tactics proposed by Mathoma. And so I guess that's my framing of the discussion, and that's my opening.
Well, thank you, Matt. You now have 5 minutes of rebuttal to begin with, starting now.
Well, I can't think of anything to say in the rebuttal that I didn't already acknowledge in the opening. A lot of his opening cut short a huge chunk of stuff I was going to talk about in mine, so I actually put some of my rebuttal near the end. So I guess I'll forfeit the rest of my time and see what he has to say.
Okay. So you have 5 minutes to begin your rebuttal, Mathoma.
Right. So I think there are many interesting points brought up there by Logos. I understand that in the conventional worldviews, we often talk about things like causality and necessary connections. But I'd like to remind him that there is a slightly different worldview we have to consider too. And that's really given rise to much of the knowledge we know about science. And that's the respect that we have for using our sense apparatus to to come to knowledge. And if we're going to be using this sense apparatus, we have to even question things like causality and necessary connections. Now, causality, I mean, I've never seen a causality in real life. I've never seen causality itself. I've seen the supposed effects of the postulation of the mental concept called causality, but I've never empirically seen causality. So my conclusion is that it's just a habit of the mind. So I think this whole concept of causality and necessary connections and even independence needs to be questioned using skeptical means as well. I think it was also said that I think by analogy of like rolling the dice, I mean, I certainly agree that improbable things do happen. I mean, I have no quandary with that. But what I'm saying here is just giving a relative comparison of the probability of multiple alternative hypotheses. On the one hand, we might have the hypothesis that the testimony of a miracle is correct, in which case the miracle did actually happen, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the possibility that that the testimony is mistaken in some way, or that the person is lying, which would, this would undercut our credibility. This would undercut the person's credibility, and we shouldn't really accept this. What I'm doing here is just giving a relative comparison of these probabilities. I mean, I certainly acknowledge that both numbers might be very low, but I think we have to come back to this rational principle that we have to go with the more likely hypothesis. And as David Hume points out, that we really shouldn't believe in miracles unless the whole notion that the testimony is false is even more miraculous. All right, so the falsity of the testimony has to be even more miraculous to actually be rationally justified in believing in miracles. I'm not sure if this relative comparison of these two alternatives was actually addressed in Logos's opening statement here. I'd like to question it further later on in debate whether he actually accepts this rational principle that we have to weigh two hypotheses and go with the more likely one. And furthermore, I'd like to say that I'm not discounting anyone's testimony at all. I assume, I mean, if anyone gives me a testimony of some miracle, I'll assume just for sake of argument that they're talking with the best intentions, that they're not lying to me. But we still have to apply these skeptical principles here. We have to, when they claim that they've seen a miracle, we have to consider the possibility that their testimony is mistaken in some way. Now we have to think of that relative probability of the testimony being false and compare that to our probability of the miracle actually happening. And when comparing those probabilities, we have to bring the evidence of our senses into play here. And like I said in my opening statement, I think given the regularities of our experiences with things like dead men staying dead and seas not being parted, we can't really be justified in believing these miracles. Now, I would also concede that there are also some pragmatic justifications, but I'm not really too interested in pragmatic justifications here. I mean, certainly believing in miracles might be comforting in certain situations, and that might be brought to bear, like when maybe like some atheist is trying to deconvert someone on their deathbed, or on the reverse. Perhaps there are some pragmatic justifications for believing in miracles, but the sort of justification I'm looking for here is justification that most people would be expecting, like a rational justification by using natural reason, using evidence to come to a conclusion about truth, what the truth actually is, not, I mean truth as it relates to reality, not some sort of pragmatic justification. And in the example of the ghost, yeah, certainly it might be useful to not apply skeptical methods, but what I'm more interested in is truth here. And perhaps we can get into this in the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Mathoma. So who should go first on the cross-examination? We had originally chosen Mathoma, but since Matt forfeited his rebuttal, I'm thinking maybe Matt should go first in cross-examination. Does that work for both you guys?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay,
Sure.
Matt. So your 10 minutes of cross-examination begin now.
All right. So you're saying something about relying purely on sensory information, and you were. Can you explain to me what you mean about causality in your reply?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about using these concepts like causality, but I've never really seen this thing called causality. I mean, I have some cups, and I have a cup on the table right here. I mean, I can empirically see that. It's quite obvious to my senses. But I mean, I can't see causal relations and necessary connections. So I don't really have any evidence to think that those exist.
Okay, so from a scientific perspective, right, because we're talking to the good men and women of science in this discussion, what basis do we have then, if causality is suspect, that when they run an experiment with sufficient controls in place, that they can expect similar outcomes every time? I mean, how do you explain the idea of repeatability if causality itself is suspect?
Well, I would say that what we're doing when we invoke notions like causality, this isn't really something that we're picking up in reality. This is just a habit of the mind. We're very accustomed to talking in a language of causality, but I don't think it's a real thing. And the reason I say that is just for the simple reason I can't see causal relations. It's not like like cause. I would expect it to be like some ectoplasm flowing from one thing to another. I mean, I can't see these causal things. I mean, has anyone ever seen a causal relation?
Well, that's true. No one ever has seen a causal relation, but okay, I guess that's like asking if anybody has ever seen the equal. How do you take the Platonic notions of like the equal or the good or the beautiful? People have never seen the things in question, but we have no problem ascribing properties to things. I mean, how do you reconcile this?
Yeah, like I said, when people talk about that, I think they're really reflecting a custom and a habit they've gotten into. They're used to using the language of the good and causality, but I think under empirical scrutiny, they're not really justified in thinking this is some aspect of reality that they're noticing.
Okay, so in that case, if we run a scientific experiment under different controlled settings, or the same controlled settings, it's fully rational to expect that we might get completely different outcomes from our experiments then.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, you get a different outcome.
Interesting. So that seems to put science itself on very, very shaky foundations. The idea of science seems to me to be we kind of observe and predict patterns in the universe by noticing the same things happening again and again and again, and we try to pinpoint what causes the things we want to see versus what doesn't cause. We try to extrapolate the laws in question from everything else. But if we're unable to distinguish between causes, what law causes this, what law causes that, I mean, how do we even go about separating the things? Everything, it seems, just happened, we just observe it. I mean, how is science reconciled under this construction?
Yeah, I don't really ascribe causal roles to things like scientific laws. I think that's that's some historical baggage from the Platonic philosophy. Like I said in the opening, I think laws are they're just sense experiences. It's one sensory experience over and over and over again, and then the mind just ascribes the regularity to it. So we're just in the mind of perceiving laws of nature. I don't think laws of nature are like these abstract things. Maybe they're made of ectoplasm or something that have causal powers. I think if science is using those in that way, it might.
Okay, interesting. So I guess to move over to something else for a minute, you said that you're not discounting the testimony of these people when you apply their testimony to probabilities and cast them out if their lying is more likely or the miracle's unlikely. Can you expand on that for a minute?
About not discounting their testimony?
Right. How do you reject their testimony or the results of it without discounting it?
Oh, well, I mean, like if someone reports a miracle to me, I'll assume that they're not lying to me. But I mean, at the same time, we have to consider whether they were mistaken or not, right? So, I mean, either the testimony is correct and the miracle actually did happen, or the testimony is in some way false. I mean, it could be false for a couple of different reasons. I mean, they could be mistaken, perhaps like a hallucination or something, or they could be deliberately lying to me. I mean, so like I said, I'm not discounting that. I'm not like assuming that they're lying or something. But I'm just saying that we need to consider the possibility that the testimony is mistaken in some way, and we need to make a relativistic comparison of those probabilities between the alternative hypotheses of the testimony being accurate with it being false in some way.
I see. Okay, so would it be fair to say that you would believe that they believe the testimony they're giving to you?
Oh, sure.
Okay, it's fair enough. So, okay, now the last question I have is the idea of opportunity cost. I mean, how is, okay, if you have two average people talking about miracles, how is the average person supposed to find time in a day to put to scrutiny, the type of scrutiny you're suggesting, every possible testimony of every possible miracle they might hear in conversation? I mean, is it even feasible to suggest these things?
Pragmatically speaking, perhaps they can't. Maybe they don't have enough time in a day to skeptically investigate all these sorts of things. So even like in the pragmatic sense, maybe there's some sort of pragmatic justification, but I mean, the justification I'm interested in is whether we can actually get the truth. I mean, some things might be very useful to believe that, but that doesn't mean they're true. I mean, when we're evaluating miracles, especially given the importance of these miracles, we have to we can't just use pragmatic reasoning. We have to use reasoning which is directed toward getting to truth. And certainly, I mean, even if one person doesn't have enough time to investigate a miracle claim, Fanny, these are things that everyone knows. I mean, we can all kind of budget some time to sit around and think about these sorts of things. So I don't think the opportunity cost is really. I don't think pragmatics are an issue for many of the miracles that people actually care about.
I see. So your concern primarily seems to be with more historical miracles, like the Bible, the Jesus resurrection, and things like that.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, like I said, the significance of this conversation is, like I said, like with a lot of religions, there's a whole panoply of miracles that give the religion some meaning and make it into a coherent system. So I mean, these are kind of the miracles that I'm really interested in. But I mean, we can apply the skepticism more generally to any sort of miracle that we wanted to. But yeah, I would concede that I'm most interested in the miracles of religions.
Okay, so trying to formulate another question here. Hold on.
Right.
No, I think that's about it. I can't think of any more questions to ask you.
All right, that's fine. We've been joined by Anarcho, and since Matt already forfeited his 5 minutes of cross-examination, or no, 5 minutes of rebuttal, we can give Anarcho, say, 3 minutes of Q&A if he'd like to in the cross-examination.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So starting now, Anarcho, you have 3 minutes to ask questions to either Mathoma or Mediator.
Yeah, it doesn't seem his mic is working.
In which case, we'll let Mathoma begin his 10 minutes of cross-examination, starting now.
Right. Yeah, so I was a bit interested there in your discussion of the frequentist versus non-frequentist theories of probability. Presumably by non-frequentist, you're referring to like the Bayesian theory and all that. I'm not quite sure what the relevance was to the. I mean, we're discussing whether the Humean empirical conception of nature and miracles is correct. I mean, what relevance does the distinction between Bayesian and perhaps frequentist probability have to do with this?
Oh, well, okay. So there's three possibilities when talking about miracles. Either they're impossible, deductively impossible, which I didn't have to go into too much because you conceded that in your opening. Right. There's the possibility that miracles are necessarily improbable, and so we shouldn't believe them because they are necessarily improbable. Now, one of the reasons people argue for miracles being necessarily improbable is due to the frequentist idea that they are, by definition, low frequency events. They don't happen very often, and they're so if you're looking at an event on average, you know, it's less likely to be a miracle just due to the low frequency. And so my entire example was basically saying, well, those assumptions are a bit shakier if that was the route that somebody wanted to argue down. If you don't assume that your sample space of events are independent, well, if we look at the universe having some causality, I swing my axe and, chop down a tree and gravity knocks it over. That's not me chopping down a tree and then a tree falling down as two independent events. There is some sort of causality there, I would say, that makes the probability, more interesting. Now, you said in our previous cross-examination that you don't believe in the idea of causality because it's not empirically verifiable. And so I guess this entire investigation is fruitless then, because it then comes down to a question of the independency of events in the universe.
I mean, perhaps like with the causality stuff, all we're really seeing there is it's a relation between habits of mind. I mean, I don't think we're latching onto some aspect of reality with causation, but anyway, even if we kind of go under like a non-frequentist worldview with probability, like a Bayesian one, in the Bayesian theory, even with that, you need some sort of theory of prior probabilities, because the Bayesian view tells you how to go from prior to posterior probabilities. So even in the Bayesian framework, it seems like even the prior probabilities have to be extremely low for things like miracles by way of our sense experience. So even under the Bayesian one, wouldn't you acknowledge that we're dealing with extremely unlikely events, and that you need some real evidence to overcome these low probabilities?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I can't discount that one bit. I mean, that's the idea of miracles. I mean, if miracles happened every day in the sense that they were just obvious, then what significance would they have when they occur? I don't think anybody would deny that.
Mm-hmm. Another thing too, I guess my central argument that first of all, let me ask you, do you agree with that idea that when we compare alternative hypotheses, that we have to go just using reason alone, we have to go with the more probable of the two alternatives?
I guess it depends on what our goals are. If you're gambling, you're obviously going to want to go with the way that wins you the most money most probably, because nobody wants to be in the habit of losing money. But I guess the conversation about miracles are about much more than just naturalistic ideas. There's cosmic discussions at play, good, evil, human nature, all sorts of abstract concepts that empiricism can't really touch in that way. So there might be other axes to consider the probabilities from the basis of, not just getting to efficient outcomes.
But what if you're interested in the truth? What should you do there under the probabilistic framework?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, well, I guess it's
because after all, after all, I mean, we have justifications, which are, I mean, we care about justifications because we're interested in the truth, right? So I guess, I mean, we could talk about pragmatism all day and all the sorts of factors, but I guess the highest pragmatic factor is truth, right? We're interested in what is truth, not what truth is, but what is the truth about miracles?
What's the truth of the matter? Okay. Well, okay. So this is where I brought in the idea that the defibrillator in previous conversation, right? So we have to be really, really careful, because the idea of the setup of this testimony construction is to discount the miraculous, but it could inadvertently end up discounting things that sound miraculous, right? So if somebody says, "Hey, I saw a guy use this cool machine device thing, and this guy that was dead, I checked his pulse, I checked his heartbeat, everything I couldn't revive him, I couldn't bring him back, zapped him with this machine and popped up he went," right? Certain periods of history, that would be miraculous. I mean, what would Humean testimony have to say about that, really?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly concede that there are events that seem miraculous, but as you said, I mean, there are a lot of things that, like in ancient times, that would be totally miraculous. I mean, the very conversation we're having right now is totally miraculous relative to ancient times. I mean, what are we doing right now? We're kind of, we're almost instantaneously communicating with one another. I mean, if we were using like a cell phone, we're communicating with one another using radio waves. I mean, what in the world are those in the ancient world? I mean, those are things that seem like miracles, but of course, in retrospect, we're not going to say that using your cell phone is miraculous. I mean, that's just part of the way nature works. So, I mean, in light of that evidence, I would say that when we see something that's unexpected, we shouldn't therefore conclude that it's a miracle. By way of analogy to things that we do actually have sensory experience with, we should hold out for a future scientific explanation of that thing.
Oh, sure. Okay, so let me ask you a quick question then. So there's a distinction it looks like you're trying to make between okay, there's three possible distinctions we can make here in a discussion. There's, I don't believe the thing you say happened. It sounds like you mistook something, or you're crazy, or you're lying, or this thing you did see happen, I'll admit that it probably happened, but it has a scientific explanation, or this thing happened and there is no scientific explanation. There's one of three things. It's difficult under your construction to know, given your rejection of somebody's testimony, exactly which one you'll pick. And given which one you'll pick, it seems likely that you could discount absolutely true events with maybe even a scientific explanation attached to them as miraculous and therefore discountable.
Well, once again, I would say that we have to rely upon our experience. I mean, like I said, we have actual cases of events that they're superficially miraculous, but upon further examination, we find that they're totally within the course of nature. So, I mean, I'm not sure of any other way we're supposed to get to like general principles of knowledge other than using our sense apparatus. I mean, what else are we supposed to use anyway? But again, let me ask you, if you're concerned with truth, would you agree to that principle that when you have two alternative hypotheses, let's say X and Y, if X is more probable, then you should believe X?
I guess I would say it's not quite so binary, because I have the same apprehensions that I just mistook. If it's binary, as in you believe or not believe one thing or the other thing, I think that I can throw out way, way, way too many things that are true, maybe even for reasons independent of the testimony given, to think about. So I don't want to risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater, is I guess my overall point there.
Yeah, I mean, you see that you're questioning some fundamental logic here. I mean, if you have some testimony, either the testimony is true or false, right?
It is true. But in what way is it true? So if somebody back, before defibrillators were common, saw somebody use one for the first time, would you say he didn't see a man revived from the dead? Is that statement false? Or is the miraculous part of the revival the false part of the statement? And how do you know?
Well, I mean, in that case, he's just, I mean, the testimony is accurate, but it's just not what he thinks it is. So in that sense, there's a part of the testimony which is false.
Well, exactly. So we had to believe his testimony in that the miraculous happened. Remember, your initial statement was the dead don't often come back to life, right? They stay dead. So if this guy says, hey, I saw this dead guy come back, and everybody says, well, they never come back and never seen that before, because maybe back then they don't know what a defibrillator is. See, I feel like we're putting the benefit of hindsight into a testimony about present or future events of which we can have no knowledge. And that's where we're getting mixed up.
Okay, the 10 minutes are up, but I will give you 10 seconds to answer him, Mathoma.
Yeah, what was the thought? Oh, yeah, using hindsight. Well, I mean, I certainly think we do have to use some. We have to look at things retrospectively. I mean, we have, like in our modern scientific worldview, we have like an accumulation of knowledge. Certainly, we have to use hindsight. We have to apply the same rational principles we use nowadays to analyze skeptically historical questions.
Okay. Let's see if your mic is working, Anarcho. Looks like it's not. In which case, we will begin the concluding remarks. The first 5 minutes will go to Matt, starting now.
All right, thanks. This has been a very, very interesting discussion. I'm happy to know that on the outset of the debate, so much was granted. I didn't have to argue about whether miracles were possible at all. To a lesser extent, I mean, we talked about miracles being unlikely, but I think we could conclude that they weren't necessarily unlikely in some deductive sense, but they just happen to be due to our experience. And that might very well be true. As to the final stretch of the questioning, I think that's where the conversation reached its most interesting point as far as just truth-telling is concerned, right? If we're interested in the truth. I think this comes down to a more fundamental disagreement between my worldview and the Humean one. I think to find the truth, you must first avoid discounting all things that could be true. And so that means sometimes I'll have to admit some statements as indecidable. So in the case of the defibrillator that I kept bringing up, we know that defibrillators work. And so after the testimony, after the fact, we can come back and explain the defibrillator. But first, in the meantime, before we can even have that as, say, record, we have to acknowledge that the testimony could be something true and actually happened. If there was a prototype defibrillator that was never invented and some guy said, hey, I saw so-and-so get brought back by some crazy machine I'd never seen before. Well, if the testimony on the outset was discussed as lying or hallucination or something else and just basically torn up or, put in some psych word somewhere, how could we ever explain it in the future development of the defibrillator? Or maybe we could hunt the guy down and say, hey, that tech is pretty cool, let's take a look at that defibrillator, and boom, they're mass produced. So this idea of truth value, I don't think you get to the truth by necessarily throwing out or rejecting in various ways certain things just because they're improbable, but merely I prefer to look at things as true because we know about them, or indecidable until we can see otherwise. And that, I think, seemed to be the central disagreement along the discussion. I think I'll conclude there.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Mathoma, your 5 minutes of concluding begin now.
Right. So, like I said in my opening statement, I mean, I totally think miracles are at least metaphysically possible. I mean, even under the empirical worldview, for the reason that they don't logically contradict laws of nature. There's no logical contradiction there. I mean, once again, we have to ask the question, we have to ask the skeptical question, whether we're ever justified in believing in any of these so-called miracles. And once again, the significance of this question is quite profound. Miracles sit at the root of most religions. But once again, I have to come back and reject a lot of this pragmatism here. I mean, I'm certainly interested in the truth. I mean, most people, I think, are interested in the truth. I mean, certainly if Christians found out that there were certain historical parts of the religion which were false, that would certainly affect things. It's not just a matter of pragmatism. I mean, certain things it's important that they actually happened historically. And if we're interested in the truth, we have to use the empirical and scientific method to compare alternative hypotheses. We have to come up with a bunch of different explanations and compare the likelihoods that each one might be true. And certainly we might not know absolutely right now which of those alternatives might be true. We have to go with the general principle. We have to go with that principle that says go with the more likely one. And certainly I think that central argument hasn't really been answered in this debate. If we have two alternative hypotheses, let's say the possibility that the miracle testimony is correct, which is extremely low because the miracle is by definition extremely unlikely. Then we have the alternative, which is that the guy is mistaken in some way, and I'll emphasize that in some way. Perhaps there's there's some aspect of nature he's not aware of. Perhaps he's lying. Perhaps he's hallucinating in some way. I'm not sure which of those explanations is the correct one, but that includes things that we do actually have experience with. We have experiences where people were unaware of certain parts of the natural world. We have experience of people lying. We have experiences with people being mistaken. So I think just in that relative comparison of the two alternatives, we have to go with the latter, which is that the testimony is mistaken in some way, and therefore we're not justified in actual miracles. I mean, I don't know if they actually happened or not. I don't think I'm actually justified in believing in these sorts of things. And another point I'd like to come back to is that whenever we see one of these so-called miracles, we have the general trend in history that whenever we see these supposedly miraculous events, they end up being explained in some way by science. For example, people in the medieval times used to think that diseases were related to some bizarre motion of the planets or something that they did, like some sin. But I mean, science then comes along and comes up with things like the germ theory of disease, and it comes up with mechanistic ways to explain why people got sick. We don't need any of these miracle claims. So if we're going to adopt that, this is something we have actual experience with. There's a lot of historical evidence of getting explained away using the scientific method. So if we go with that, that's another reason we're not really justified in believing in miracles. Another point, I didn't bring this up too deeply in my opening, but a lot of these miracles get recorded, it seems, in the past, in what seemed to me to be rather barbaric societies, and among extremely illiterate and ignorant people. I mean, certainly if miracles are possible, if it's possible to believe in miracles by a lay of natural reason, it should be we should have cases where educated people in a group can come together and actually witness a miracle. I mean, why don't we see these miracles occurring nowadays? It always seems that these miracles get deferred to like 2,000 years in the past. I mean, why don't we see these miracles happening nowadays in front of educated and literate people? Really, feel like they're justified in believing that in the truth of these miracles. And I mean, I emphasize the truth of the miracles, not just some comforting, pragmatic justification that, oh, if the miracle were true, it would make me feel good. I mean, as scientific men and women here, we have to be interested in truth over feelings. But like I said, though, I mean, only one could have some sort of faith that these miracles happened. I mean, perhaps I'll concede some of that pragmatic justification, but I'm interested in justification in the sense of getting to the truth.
Your time is up, Mathoma.
Thank you.
So this concludes the debate. I thank Mathoma and Logos for joining us. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise to Folly podcast, signing off.